Hello, Sunday school teachers, preachers, and students. Welcome to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. What man in his right mind asks a woman to feed him first before she feeds her only child her last meal? If he's in his right mind, the answer is clearly a man with a lot of faith. This week I show how both the prophet Elijah and the unnamed widow of Zarephath demonstrate their faith in God's provision. Elijah travels a great distance only to learn that the woman God commanded to feed him had just a handful of food. I believe it took a great deal of faith for Elijah to ask this nameless woman, this nameless widow, to feed him first. I also believe it took even more faith for the nameless widow to actually follow Elijah's instructions. Can you imagine your mother? Or can you imagine you feeding someone you don't even know the last part of your meager meal? Now that's real faith. They both had to really believe that God really would provide. This foreign woman didn't know Elijah, and she didn't know Elijah's God, but somehow she knew what the true and living God required of her, and she did it. Likewise, Elijah was in the heart of Baal worship territory, and he knew nothing about this woman. But both of them were faithful to what God instructed, and as a result, both were saved in their time of distress. Some ideas surrounding this week's text include the terms miracle and faithfulness. Now, if you have Wi-Fi in your church Sunday school classroom or wherever you share this lesson, this channel is a good way to teach and discuss this lesson. What I provide is a concise overview of background, context, characters, themes, and topics that gets to the point, saves you time, and enhances your own teaching and study. If that's what you're looking for, you're in the right place. But the only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. So please subscribe, like, comment, and then click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. Also, I want to thank all of the new subscribers who've come onto this channel over the last few weeks. I'm grateful for your subscription to my channel, and I'm even more grateful that you're finding it helpful. Also, if you want to support this work, I accept correspondence and gifts at 1590 Jonesboro Road Southeast, Box 150032, Atlanta, Georgia, 30315. So with that said, welcome again to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. Let's go to work. First, we'll look at the background for today's text. The books of 1st and 2nd Kings, like its name suggests, features the kings of the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. 1st Kings begins with King David as an old man about to leave the scene. But before David dies, of course, there is some family drama surrounding who's going to succeed him. In the first chapter, after some drama, Solomon ascends to the throne. And this is before David's united kingdom is divided into two kingdoms. The two books of 1st Kings and 2nd Kings were originally one book in the Hebrew Bible, but were divided into two scrolls when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek. And that's a quote from the New Interpreter Study Bible. And together, they cover a period of almost 400 years from the ascension of Solomon to the fall of Jerusalem in 587 BCE. The NISB also notes that the writers of Kings selected, combined, and arranged the written and oral traditions of Israel and Judah to express their theological understanding of their histories. The sources they used included the books of the Acts of Solomon. You can see 1 Kings 11:41, and the books of the Annals of the Kings of Judah, and that's mentioned 15 times, beginning with Rehoboam in 1 Kings, the 14th chapter, verse 29. They also used other unnamed sources, including the narrative of the last days of David, and several sources providing information about the prophets Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, and other prophets. So just as the first 5 books of the Old Testament are known as the books of law, 1st and 2nd Kings are 2 of the 12 books known as the books of history. Nelson's Bible Handbook notes that early tradition credited the prophet Jeremiah with the writing of these 2 books, but most scholars today no longer hold to the Jeremiah theory. Evidence points to an unknown prophet who worked at the same time as Jeremiah to compile this history. The 17th chapter of 1 Kings introduces the prophet Elijah. Nelson's indicates that Solomon entered the scene about 971 before Christ. The kingdom divided about 931 before Christ, and Elijah and Elisha would have entered the scene about 66 years later, around 865 BC before Christ. Scholars believe Elijah's prophetic ministry lasted from 865 to 847 before Christ. It's important to note that part of what Elijah portrays is God's power over other false gods. Miracles happen in 1 Kings that, as the NISB says, reflect prophetic opposition to the rise of the cult of Baal and Asherah in Israel as introduced by Ahab and his wife Jezebel. 1 Kings, the 16th chapter, verse 30, tell us that Ahab did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. Ahab marries Jezebel, who lives among the Phoenicians. Phoenicia was in the heart of Baal worship territory, and that's a quote from Townsend commentary. In this 17th chapter, God sends Elijah into the heart of Jezebel's home territory. Elijah's mission is to demonstrate God's power over and above the power of Baal. Townsend commentary notes that Baal was worshipped as a fertility god and was supposed to make it rain. Some important words to consider from this text include miracle and faithfulness. So let's review last week and see how it connects to this week. Last week's lesson covered Moses' perspective after wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. The focus last week was to understand that God expected Israel's obedience. At this point, Moses knew that he was not going to enter the promised land. Moses knew that there would be new leadership guiding the Israelites into the promised land and going forward. So at this point, Moses was driving home the importance of obeying God. The old generation had died out. The new generation was about to see the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. In verse 1, Moses opened with an admonition to heed the statutes and ordinances that he was teaching. He told them, so that you may live to enter and occupy the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. Moses knew, and all of Israel should have known, that the old generation died in the wilderness because they were not faithful to an obedient God and obedient to God. Moses reminds them so that you may live. In verse 2, Moses warned the Israelites not to add anything to what I command you, nor to take anything away from it. This same idea is echoed in Revelations, the 22nd chapter, verses 18 and 19. The NISB notes that the comprehensive nature of God's law did not rule out additions to its written text. You can check Deuteronomy, the 1st chapter, verse 5, where Moses expounded on earlier laws. The written law could receive clarification and revision, but its fundamental truth as God's covenant law would remain unchanged. In verse 3, Moses reminded them of what God did to those who followed the Baal of Peor. I noted how the NISB explained that Baal is another name for a god, and that the Baal of Peor mentioned here involved sexual relations with the women of Moab. You can check Numbers, the 25th chapter, verses 1 through 5. And this worship of Baal of Peor encouraged these sexual encounters with Moabite women. And this was at the sanctuary. This was at the sanctuary of the Israelites. Townsend commentary noted that 24,000 Israelites died because of unfaithfulness. In verse 4, Moses made the stark contrast between faithfulness and unfaithfulness. He told the Israelites, "Those of you who held fast to the Lord your God are all alive today." This was a reminder that unfaithfulness leads to death. Their parents and forebears had died because of unfaithfulness. In verse 5, Moses told the Israelites he was following instruction from God. He was teaching them to observe statutes and ordinances that they should observe in the land. Moses knows that they're going to face temptation to stray away from God, just as their parents and forebears did in the wilderness. In verse 6, he presses the point to follow the statutes and ordinances diligently. Then he added that following these statutes and ordinances diligently will show your wisdom and discernment to the people who, when they hear them, will say, "Surely this is a great nation of wise and discerning people." Moses expected the neighboring nations to admire the Israelites. However, the Israelites would show soon enough that Moses' faith in the people was misplaced. Verse 7 and 8 show how much hope and trust Moses placed in the Israelites. Moses imagines other nations saying, "What other great nation has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is whenever we call to him?" Moses knew he wouldn't enter the promised land. He knew things would soon be out of his control. These laws, these statutes and ordinances that God had given him were his greatest possession. These were the statutes and ordinances that he had worked on across the years. These statutes and ordinances, these laws, were his most valuable possession and the very best he had to offer to a people who would soon stray from the very God whom Moses had so diligently served. In verses 12 and 13, Moses reminded the Israelites of the power, majesty, and grandeur of the God of their covenant. He reminded them how God spoke to them out of the fire. And he reminded them that it wasn't just him coming up with these laws all on his own. These laws came from God. They weren't just laws to follow, but more so these laws were the covenant between them and God. In these 10 commandments, they would understand their duties and responsibilities toward God and their fellow human beings. I noted that these 10 commandments may have been written 3,400 years ago, but they're still relevant today. In these commandments and statutes, we begin to understand how to relate to God and each other. Last week, Moses' response to God's faithfulness was to encourage the Israelites to remain faithful going forward. He knew they would face temptation to worship other gods, but wanted them to remain obedient in faith. This week, we see a widow who has almost nothing left, and by her own words, is about to eat her last meal and die. It's her act of faith to feed the prophet of God first that saves her and her son's life. She's blessed for her faithfulness. Townsend and Boyd's commentaries titled this week's lesson, Blessed for Faithfulness. Standard Commentary titles this lesson, Active Faith. The scripture text comes from 1 Kings, the 17th chapter, verses 8 through 16. I'll read that text for you now from the New Revised Standard Version. We begin with a section entitled, The Widow of Zarephath. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Go now to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and live there, for I have commanded a widow there to feed you. So he set out and went to Zarephath. When he came to the gate of the town, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and said, Bring me a little water in a vessel, so that I may drink. As she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. But she said, As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of meal in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I'm now gathering a couple of sticks, so that I may go home and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Elijah said to her, Do not be afraid. Go and do as you have said. But first, make me a little cake of it and bring it to me. And afterwards, make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of meal will not be emptied, and the jug of oil will not fail until the day that the Lord sends rain on the earth. She went and did as Elijah said, so that she as well as he and her household ate for many days. The jar of meal was not emptied, neither did the jug of oil fail, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. So what takes place in this passage? At first glance, it would seem that this week's lesson is focused on the faithfulness of the unnamed widow of Zarephath. Without question, she deserves that consideration. But when I look a little closer, I see the faithfulness of Elijah also. At any rate, faithfulness is the topic. Our lesson begins at verse 8 with a phrase that's often repeated in the Old Testament. The word of the Lord came to me. This phrase indicates that the reader should pay special attention. God is about to speak. In verse 9, the Lord tells Elijah to go to Zarephath, which is a city near Sidon on the Phoenician coast. The Lord tells Elijah to live there because the Lord has commanded a widow who lives there to feed him. The NISB explains that God sends Elijah, among the Phoenicians, which is the center of Baal worship, to demonstrate that even in the land of Baal, the Lord is sovereign. In other words, God is sending Elijah away from the land of Israel into a foreign land, and ultimately, God will show that the one true and living God is God outside Israel also. It's important to note two things here. First, the Lord has already commanded a widow to take care of Elijah. And secondly, this widow lived in the heart of Baal worship territory, so she was likely not a worshiper of Elijah's God. She probably worshiped Baal. Townsend commentary notes that the Old Testament portrays God as being particularly concerned for the widow, the orphan, and the poor. That is, the vulnerable and marginalized in society. In this chapter, we see God using a woman who most likely doesn't even know who the one true and living God is. But yet God uses this woman to show God's sovereignty. The point is, God can use whomever God wants to use. God can deliver whomever God wants to deliver. Just because they don't do religion the way you do religion doesn't mean God doesn't care for them. In verse 10, Elijah goes to Zarephath. When he arrives at the gate of the city, the unnamed widow was there gathering sticks. Elijah asked her for a drink of water. In verse 11, she was going to get the water when Elijah asked her for a morsel of bread. In verse 12, the unnamed widow said, "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of meal in a jar and a little oil in a jug." Elijah has traveled all this way only to discover that the woman God commanded to feed him has but a handful of meal. She tells Elijah that she's gathering a few sticks so she can go home, prepare her meal for herself and her son, and then eat it and die. This unnamed widow is in a terrible situation. She only has a handful of food left, and she literally has no hope of living beyond her last meal. She's given up. She's given up hope, and she has no one and nowhere to turn to for help. Townsend commentary notes that the status of widows in ancient Israel society was precarious, having no inheritance rights and often in want of life's necessities. She was exposed to harsh treatment and exploitation. In verse 13, Elijah tells her, "Don't be afraid. Go and do as you said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me. Then make something for yourself and your son." It's this verse that strikes me as a powerful way to show Elijah's faithfulness also. Here, Elijah had to know that God would provide. What man in his right mind would dare ask a woman who's about to make her last meal for her only child to feed him first? This took faith on Elijah's part. He had to know that God was going to take care of this woman and her son. In verses 14 and 15, Elijah tells the widow, "The Lord, the God of Israel, says the jar of meal will not be emptied and the jug of oil will not fail until the Lord sends rain on the earth." The unnamed widow did as Elijah said. so that Elijah and her household ate for many days. This woman deserves every bit of credit due her for not just listening to the man of God, but truly believing that God would be her provider. Can you imagine what your mother might have said to someone who told her to feed them first, when she knew all she had was a small handful of food? Now, my mother has a reputation for feeding people. Maybe she's capable of it. Maybe my mother's capable of it. But I just can't imagine her feeding someone else what she believes to be her last meal before she feeds her own children. The faith of this unnamed widow is astounding. She really believed. She believed the man of God, and she believed that God would take care of her and her son. Verse 16 closes this lesson, helping us to know that God did provide. The jar of meal was not emptied, neither did the jug of oil fail, according to the word of the Lord that Elijah spoke. The unnamed widow only had a handful of meal and a little oil, but God made her little last a long time. God multiplied her little to become much. Beloved, that's good news for us today. You might not have much in your own eyes, but what you do have, God can use it and make it last. So let's give the text some context. Townsend Commentary notes that during the famine, Elijah was fed by God via unclean ravens that brought him food, and later by a widow who was not part of the household of faith. God is creator of all of this universe. Acts the 10th chapter verse 15 reminds us what God has made clean, you must not call profane. You and I are created imago Dei, that is, in the image of God. Just because someone doesn't look like you, act like you, wear their clothes like you, speak like you, have the same ableness of you, or have your religious standards, doesn't mean God doesn't care for them and love them in the same way God cares for and loves you. The unnamed widow of Zarephath didn't know Elijah, but God saved her and her son in the process of saving Elijah. As long as we claim to be God's people, we ought to treat everybody right. Key characters in this text. Of course, Elijah is a key character. Elijah is the first great prophet of the northern kingdom of Israel. Elijah is known to abruptly enter the scene to confront Ahab's worship of Baal, the Canaanite god of storm, rain, and fertility. The widow of Zarephath is another key character in the text, as she's defined as an unnamed widow in Zarephath of Sidon, a Phoenician city. She's known for responding in faith to Elijah's request to feed him first from her last meal. Key words in the text, not necessarily in the text, but good for discussion. One might be miracle. A miracle is defined as an event that is considered unusual or extraordinary in that it appears to be contrary to what is currently known of nature. Theologically, the emphasis is on what God has revealed through this event, as in the miracles of Jesus. Faithfulness is another key word. Faithfulness is defined as the characteristic of being steadfastly loyal to a person or to promises. Theologically, it is a basic description of God who's perfectly faithful to all that God promises, in contrast to sinful humans who are unfaithful in their relationships and actions. Themes, topics, discussion, or sermon preparation ideas. One might be faithfulness for the hopeless. And the second might be faithfulness after hopelessness. And of course, we can think about Elijah after fleeing Jezebel. And then questions. One question that you might ask your listeners: if you were the widow of Zarephath, would you be able to believe God and feed Elijah first? And then a second question. Elijah went to the heart of Baal worship territory. Would you be able to do the same, recognizing that your life might be in danger for speaking against Baal? And a concluding thought. Faithfulness can be demonstrated in a number of ways. Some of those ways include a sexually exclusive marriage, the loyalty of a friendship, the unwavering commitment to a mission, or resolute and firm trust in a person, group, or cause, among other ways. Faithfulness builds relationships, it secures hope, and it creates trust. Our God is the ultimate demonstration of faithfulness. Let's strive to follow God's example in our families and in our communities. And a preview of next week's lesson. Next week's lesson moves from the Old Testament to the New Testament book of Luke. I discuss how a centurion's faith can heal. A Roman centurion servant is sick unto death, but his faith so astonishes Jesus that he declares he's not seen such great faith in all of Israel. As we continue in the theme of responses to God's faithfulness, I show next week how the importance of faith in the life of faith is important in the life of believers. Next week's lesson is titled, Faith Can Heal. If you want to support this work, I accept correspondence and gifts at 1590 Jonesboro Road, Southeast, Box 150032, Atlanta, Georgia, 30315. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I am Reverend Dexter Alexander, and you've been listening to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. The only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. Please also click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. And if you don't mind, please share this site with other Sunday school teachers, preachers, and students. Thank you, and may God bless you real good.